March 1944. Pratt Army Airfield, Kansas. A B-29 Superfortress, $500,000 of American engineering, explodes into flames on the runway. Not from enemy fire, not from sabotage, but from its own engine. Within minutes, it's ash. And it's the third one this week. Across America, the most advanced bomber ever built is killing its own crews faster than the Japanese ever could. The solution won't come from MIT engineers or Boeing's best minds. It will come from a 7th grade dropout with a wrench and a memory of basement pipes. Pentagon, Washington, D.C., February 14, 1944, 2:17 p.m. The phone on General Hap Arnold's desk rang. He knew who it was before he picked it up. Roosevelt never called unless something was about to break a promise, an alliance, or a man. Mr. President, Hap. Roosevelt's voice came through sharp, despite the static. I just read the report from Pratt. Another B-29 lost. That's what 15 this month. Arnold's jaw tightened. 18, sir. Silence on the other end. Then, you promised me Tokyo by summer. I know what I promised. Then deliver, or I'll find someone who can. The line went dead. Arnold set the phone down and stared at the stack of incident reports covering his desk. Each one the same story told 18 different ways. Engine fire, catastrophic failure, crew lost or burned. He picked up the top report, dated February 12th, Pratt Army Airfield. Lieutenant David Marsh, age 24. Engines 3 and 4 caught fire at 9,000 feet. Marsh tried to bring her down. The bomber exploded on impact. No survivors. Arnold opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photo. It showed a B-29 in flight sunlight, gleaming off its silver fuselage. Underneath, someone had written, "The plane that will win the war." He crumpled it and threw it in the trash. Colonel Walsh. His aide appeared in the doorway. Sir, get me Wright Aeronautical on the phone, now, and then NACA. And then Boeing. I want answers, not excuses. Yes, sir. Walsh disappeared. Arnold stood and walked to the window. Across the Potomac, the Jefferson Memorial stood white and pristine. How many memorials would they need if the B-29 program failed? How many names carved in stone because American engineering couldn't solve a problem it created? He thought about what Roosevelt hadn't said on the phone. If you can't deliver Tokyo, we lose the Pacific. If we lose the Pacific, American boys die on islands we'll never take, and I'll make sure everyone knows it was your failure. Arnold pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Fix it, he whispered. Fix it, or we're done. Pratt. Army Airfield, Kansas, February 28, 1944, 5:43 a.m. Captain Robert Hayes stood on the tarmac in the dark, watching ground crews prep his bomber. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Danny Fraser, walked up holding 2 cups of coffee. Couldn't sleep either. Hayes took the coffee. Every time I close my eyes, I see Jimmy's plane. Fraser's voice dropped. The way it just folded, like God crumpled it up and threw it away. Jimmy Kowalski. Dead 3 weeks now. They'd flown together for 8 months, Hayes, Fraser, and Jimmy. Jimmy used to tell jokes during pre-flight checks. Stupid jokes. Why don't bombers ever get lonely because they're always winging it? Everyone groaned, but they laughed anyway. Now Jimmy was ash scattered over a Kansas field, and nobody told jokes anymore. You don't have to fly today, Hayes said. I can get someone else. Fraser looked at him. You mean someone who's not scared? I mean someone who hasn't watched 3 friends burn. Fraser drank his coffee. Captain, everyone here has watched friends burn. That's all we do now. Fly, burn, bury. If I don't fly today, I'll never fly again. And then what, I go home and tell my mom I quit because I was afraid of our own planes. Hayes wanted to argue, but Fraser was right. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. At 0630 hours, the crew assembled. 9 men. Hayes knew all their names, their hometowns, their favorite foods. He knew that Sergeant Mike Donnelly had a daughter he'd never met. That bombardier Eddie Cho sent half his pay home to his parents in San Francisco. That tail gunner Sam Ortiz carried a rosary in his pocket and prayed before every flight. Hayes looked at them. "Gentlemen, this is a standard test. We're taking her up to 15,000 feet, running full power for 10 minutes, then coming home. By the book. No heroes. Understood?" "Yes, sir." But as they climbed into the bomber, Hayes heard Ortiz whisper, "Standard test." That's what they told Jimmy, too. The four Wright R-3350 engines roared to life, each one 200 horsepower of contained violence. The bomber shook. Hayes ran through the checklist, his hands moving on autopilot. "Engine temps." Fraser checked the gauges. "Normal. For now." "For now," Hayes repeated. That phrase haunted every B-29 flight. Everything was normal for now, until it wasn't. He pushed the throttles forward. The bomber accelerated down the runway faster, and then lifted. Kansas dropped away beneath them. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, everything was perfect. Then Fraser shouted, "Number 3 cylinder head temp spiking." Hayes's eyes snapped to the gauge. 290 degrees Celsius, then 310, then 335. "Shut it down." Fraser killed the fuel to engine 3. The propeller windmilled uselessly, but the temperature kept climbing. 350, 375. "It's not stopping." Fraser's voice cracked. "Why isn't it stopping?" The flight engineer's scream came through the intercom. "Fire! We've got fire in number 3. Hayes didn't think. He banked hard left, trying to use airflow to blow the flames away from the fuel tanks. Through the cockpit window, he saw orange fire streaming from the engine cowling. Black smoke poured behind them. "Suppression system. Already activated. It's not working." Hayes felt ice flood his veins. This was how Jimmy died. Engine fire that wouldn't stop. Flames spreading to the wing root, then the fuel tanks, then nothing but a fireball tumbling through the sky. "We're going down. Brace." "Sir, we're at 12,000 feet. I said brace." Hayes aimed for a flat stretch of farmland and dove. The altimeter spun backward. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 5,000. The fire spread across the wing. Hayes could feel the heat through the cockpit wall. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, you bastard. Just give me the ground." 3,000 feet. 2,000. The ground rushed up frozen dirt and dead grass and one chance to not die screaming. Hayes pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. The bomber hit. Metal shrieked. The world became noise and impact and terror. Hayes felt his teeth crack together. Blood filled his mouth. The fuselage bounced once, twice, then skidded through the dirt, plowing a scar 300 feet long. Then stillness. "Out! Everybody out!" Hayes tore off his harness and stumbled toward the rear hatch. Smoke choked the cabin. He counted heads as the crew spilled out 7, 8, 9. All of them. Alive. They ran. 50 yards. 100. Then turned to watch. The B-29 burned. Not a small fire. A total immolation. The wings melted. The tail collapsed. $500,000 turning to ash. Fraser stood beside Hayes, blood running from his nose. "That's the 4th one this month." Hayes said nothing. What could he say? Behind them, a jeep roared up. Colonel Jameson jumped out his face stone. "Captain Hayes, debriefing, now." "Yes, sir." As they walked to the jeep, Hayes heard Ortiz behind him. "I'm not flying again. I don't care what they do to me. I'm not burning alive for a plane that wants to kill me." And Hayes couldn't blame him, because the truth was simple and terrible. The B-29 was a death trap, and nobody knew how to fix it. Wright Aeronautical Corporation, Paterson, New Jersey, March 3, 1944, 11:00 a.m. Dr. Richard Whitman stood at the head of the conference table, facing 12 of the best aeronautical engineers in America. Behind him, a blackboard covered in equations. In front of him, faces that looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. "Gentlemen," Whitman said, "we've tried everything. Bigger cowl flaps, modified baffles, different cylinder fin designs. We've run 200 wind tunnel tests. And what do we have?" Silence. Nothing. Whitman's voice rose. "We have nothing. 37 B-29s lost in the last 60 days. 37. And we're sitting here with equations that say it should work while pilots burn." A young engineer named Patterson raised his hand. "Dr. Whitman, what if the problem isn't the cooling system? What if it's the engine itself? 18 cylinders generating that much heat in that small a space. Maybe physics won't allow it. Then we tell the president what? That we built an engine that's fundamentally impossible to cool. That we wasted 2 years and $3 billion. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." Whitman slammed his hand on the table. "I'm saying we don't have the luxury of, maybe it's impossible. We make it possible. That's what engineers do." But even as he said it, Whitman felt the weight of failure pressing down. He'd been working on the R-3350 cooling problem for 16 months. 16 months of calculations, prototypes, tests. And pilots were still dying. An older engineer, Thomas Brennan, gray-haired and exhausted, spoke quietly. "Dick, we've moved the air every way we can move it. We've directed it, channeled it, forced it. But it's not enough. There's too much heat and not enough flow. So we increase the flow. We can't, not without redesigning the entire cowling, and that means grounding every B-29 for 6 months minimum." Whitman stared at the equations on the blackboard. They were beautiful, elegant, perfect, and completely useless. "Meeting adjourned," he said quietly. As the engineers filed out, Patterson lingered. "Dr. Whitman, what are we going to tell General Arnold?" Whitman looked at him. "The truth, that we're brilliant men who can't solve a simple problem, and that pilots will keep dying until someone smarter than us figures it out." Pratt. Army Airfield, Maintenance Hangar 7, March 5, 1944, 6:20 p.m. Antonio Tony Validor wiped grease from his hands and stared at the schematic pinned to the hangar wall. B-29 engine cooling system. He'd been looking at it for 3 weeks now every time his shift ended. The other mechanics thought he was crazy. "Tony, you still here?" His supervisor, Frank Gretsch, walked past carrying a clipboard. "Your shift ended an hour ago." "I know." "Then go home. Get some sleep." But Tony couldn't sleep. Every night he lay in his bunk and thought about the crashes. He'd seen 2 of them in person, bombers exploding on the runway crews running for their lives. He'd helped pull bodies from wreckage. Bodies burned so badly they didn't look human anymore. And every time he thought the same thing. This shouldn't happen. The air's not flowing right. Tony walked closer to the schematic. He traced the airflow path with his finger in through the cowling around the baffles past the cylinders. The baffles directed air toward the hot metal. That part made sense. But then what? Where did the hot air go? Nowhere. It just circulated, getting hotter and hotter. "It's stuck," Tony whispered. "Just like water in a bad pipe." He remembered his father's basement in Cleveland 20 years ago. Tony was 12 years old, holding a wrench, watching his father point at a pipe that ran too hot. "Antonio, why this pipe so hot?" "Water's stuck." "Correct. And what happens to stuck water?" "It gets hotter, pressure builds, things break." "So what you do?" "Make new path. Let it go somewhere else." His father had smiled. "You'll be good plumber someday." Tony stared at the B-29 schematic. The problem wasn't that they needed more air. They needed to let the hot air escape. A bypass. An overflow, like every plumbing system he'd ever worked on. "You need a pipe," he said aloud. "Small pipe. Takes hot air away before it builds up." "What are you mumbling about, Tony?" Gretch had circled back. "You fixing engines now?" Tony turned. "Sir, I see the problem." Gretch laughed. "You see the problem that MIT engineers can't solve." "Yes, sir." "Okay, plumber, enlighten me." Tony pointed at the schematic. "Air goes in here, gets hot here, but no place to go out, so it stays. Gets hotter. Metal breaks. You need bypass small pipe that takes hot air away from cylinders before temperature builds." Gretch stared at him, then laughed harder. "A pipe. You want to fix the most advanced aircraft engine in the world with a pipe?" "Yes, sir." "Tony, no offense, but you're a mechanic. You tighten bolts. You change oil. You don't redesign engines that cost more than your house." "I don't redesign, sir. I just fix flow." Gretch shook his head. "Stick to bolts, Validor. Leave the thinking to people who went to school for it." He walked away. Tony looked back at the schematic. He saw it so clearly, a simple aluminum tube, maybe 2 inches in diameter, that would channel hot air away from the cylinders and vent it outside the cowling. 10 pounds of metal, maybe $30 in materials. But nobody would listen to him, because he was just a plumber who'd learned his trade in basements and factory floors. What could he possibly know that engineers didn't? That night, lying in his bunk, Tony made a decision. He'd build it anyway. He didn't have permission. He didn't have approval. He didn't have anything except a wrench, some scrap aluminum, and 20 years of understanding how things flow. But if he was right, if this simple pipe could stop the fires, then he had to try, because every day he waited, someone else burned. Pentagon, General Arnold's office, March 10, 1944, 7:45 a.m. The phone rang again. Arnold picked it up. "Yes. General, it's Walsh. I have the casualty report from last week." Arnold closed his eyes. "How many?" "2 B-29s lost at Pratt. One at Walker Field in Kansas. Another at Great Bend. 15 crew members dead. 23 injured." "Jesus Christ." "Sir, there's more. The pilots are talking. Some are refusing to fly. They're calling the B-29 the Widowmaker. Morale is collapsing." Arnold felt something break inside him. Not anger, not frustration, just a cold, exhausted despair. "What do Wright and Boeing say?" "They're still working on it, sir. Dr. Whitman says they're close to a solution." "He's been saying that for 4 months." "Yes, sir." Arnold set the phone down and walked to his window. Outside, the sun was rising over Washington. Beautiful morning. Somewhere in Kansas, mothers were receiving telegrams. "We regret to inform you that your son died in a training accident. Not in combat. Not fighting the enemy. Just burning alive in a plane his own country built." "Mr. President," Arnold said quietly to the empty room, "I don't know how to fix this. And if I can't, we'll lose the war before it even reaches Japan." But across the country in a dim hangar in Kansas, a man with a 7th-grade education and dirty hands was already building the answer. He just didn't know it yet. And neither did anyone else. Because sometimes the solution doesn't come from the smartest person in the room. It comes from the one who was never invited into the room at all. And when that happens, the world has to decide, will it listen? Or will it let pride burn everything to the ground? The night of March 12, 1944. Tony Validor worked alone in Hangar 7. The lights were off. He used a flashlight clamped to his workbench, the beam cutting through the darkness like a surgical knife. In front of him lay pieces of scrap aluminum sections of damaged cowling, bent exhaust pipes, rejected parts from the salvage pile. He'd been collecting them for a week. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Scrap was scrap. Tony measured twice, cut once. His hands moved with the precision of 20 years fixing things nobody else wanted to fix. He bent the aluminum into a curved tube 2 inches in diameter, 18 inches long. Then he welded attachment brackets, small, unobtrusive, designed to clip onto existing engine mounts without drilling new holes. "Just like overflow pipe," he whispered. Hot air goes in here, comes out there. Simple. But his hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something else. Hope, maybe. Or the terror of being right when everyone said you were wrong. He thought about his father's voice. Antonio, smart people make things complicated. Wise people make things simple. At 0200 hours, Tony finished. He held up the pipe assembly and examined it under the flashlight. Crude, ugly, nothing like the polished engineering drawings pinned to the walls. But it would work. He knew it would work. The question was, would anyone let him prove it? He wrapped the assembly in canvas and hid it under his workbench. Tomorrow, he'd find a way to test it. Somehow. Tony. He spun around. Staff Sergeant Mike Donnelly stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale moonlight outside. "Mike, what are you doing here?" Donnelly walked in his boots, echoing in the empty hangar. "I could ask you the same thing. It's 2 in the morning. Couldn't sleep." Donnelly looked at the workbench, the scattered aluminum scraps, the welding torch still warm. "What are you building?" Tony hesitated. Then, something that might stop the fires. "Jesus, Tony. You're serious about this pipe thing?" "Yes." Donnelly pulled up a stool and sat down. He looked older than his 31 years, lines carved deep around his eyes, gray threading through his hair. He'd been a crew chief for 18 months. He'd seen every crash. He'd pulled bodies from wreckage. Last month, he'd held Eddie Ramirez's hand in the hospital while the man screamed through morphine-dulled agony. "Tony, I got a daughter I've never met. She's 7 months old. Her name's Claire. My wife sends me pictures, but I don't know if she knows my face." His voice cracked. "Every time I work on an engine, I think, is this the one that's gonna kill somebody's dad? Somebody's son? That's why I built this. But you're not an engineer. You didn't go to MIT. You didn't design the R3350. I don't need to design it. I just need to fix it." Donnelly was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Show me how it works." Tony unwrapped the pipe assembly. He pointed to the intake opening. "Hot air from cylinders enters here. Pipe directs it away from engine core vents outside cowling here. Creates negative pressure, pulls more cool air through faster." "That's it? That's the whole thing?" "Yes." "And you think this will stop fires that have killed 37 planes?" "I think heat kills engines because it has nowhere to go. I give it somewhere to go." Donnelly stared at the pipe. Then he laughed, not mockery, but the broken laughter of a man who'd stopped believing in miracles. "Tony, you know what's going to happen if you're wrong. They'll court-martial you for tampering with military equipment. You'll spend the rest of the war in Leavenworth." "I know. And if you're right..." Tony met his eyes. "Then maybe your daughter gets to meet her father." Donnelly's face changed. Something hardened behind his eyes, a decision forming. "Okay, I'll help you. But we need a test plane. How? Leave that to me." 2 days later, Donnelly came to Tony during the afternoon shift. "Bomber 42-24605. Number 3 engine needs a full overhaul. I'm the crew chief. I can give you 2 hours alone with it tonight. After that, it's out of my hands." Tony's heart hammered. 2 hours? That's all I can cover for. Make it count. That night, March 14th, 1944, at 2130 hours, Tony Validor climbed into the engine compartment of a B-29 Superfortress for the first time in his life. The space was cramped hot, even with the engine cold, and smelled like oil and burnt metal. He could see scorch marks on the firewall, evidence of a previous engine fire that had nearly killed the crew. He worked fast, removed the cowling access panel, located the cylinder banks, found the baffles directing air inward. Then he installed his pipe assembly, connecting the intake to the hottest section of the engine block, running the exhaust tube to an opening in the lower cowling. 30 minutes. 45. An hour. His hands were bleeding small cuts from sharp aluminum edges. His back screamed from the awkward angle. But he kept working. At 22:45 hours, he tightened the final bracket. Done. He climbed out and looked at Donnelly. It's ready. You sure? No, but we tested anyway. Donnelly wiped sweat from his forehead. Tony, if this works, you're a genius. If it doesn't, we're both finished. Then let's find out. The test was scheduled for March 16th. 800 hours. Captain Hayes was assigned as pilot, the same Hayes who'd survived the crash 3 weeks earlier. He walked around the bomber during pre-flight inspection, checking control surfaces, tires, fuel lines. When he reached Engine 3, he paused. Donnelly, what's this modification? Donnelly's throat went dry. Sir. Hayes pointed at the new pipe extending from the engine cowling. This. I don't remember this from the manual. It's a cooling enhancement, sir. Experimental. Approved by whom? Donnelly glanced at Tony, who stood 20 feet away, pretending to check a different plane. By me, sir. I'm the crew chief. It's within my authority to test minor modifications. Hayes stared at him. Sergeant, the last time someone made an experimental modification, the engine exploded at 4,000 feet. You want to tell me why I should trust this? Because, sir, I have a daughter I'd like to meet someday, and I wouldn't put anything on this plane that I thought would kill you, or me. The two men locked eyes. Hayes saw something in Donnelly's face, desperation mixed with conviction. Finally, he nodded. Okay. But if this goes wrong, you're explaining it to the colonel. Yes, sir. Hayes climbed into the cockpit. Fraser was already there, running through the checklist. Captain, I heard we've got some kind of modification on number 3. Apparently. You trust it? Hayes thought about the crash, the fire, the screaming metal. I don't trust anything about these planes anymore, Danny. But I trust Donnelly. And right now, that's all we've got. At 08:15 hours, engines 1 through 4 roared to life. Tony stood on the tarmac, his hands clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms. Beside him, Donnelly whispered, Please work. Please God, let it work. The bomber taxied to the runway, accelerated, lifted. Tony watched it climb higher until it was just a silver dot against the morning sky. Then he waited. 15 minutes, 20, 30. How long's the test? Tony asked. Full power run for 45 minutes. 45 minutes. 45 minutes for Tony's pipe to either save lives or end his career. He thought about his father again. About all those basements in Cleveland where water flowed or didn't flow, based on understanding something simple. Pressure heat and the path of least resistance. It'll work, he said aloud. It has to work. At 09:20 hours, the bomber began its descent. Tony's heart nearly stopped. Was it coming down early? Had something failed? He scanned the sky for smoke for signs of fire. But the approach looked normal. Landing gear down. Flaps extended. The bomber touched down smooth and rolled to a stop. Hayes climbed out of the cockpit. His face was unreadable. He walked straight to Donnelly. Sergeant. Sir. Engine 3 ran at full power for 47 minutes. Cylinder head temperature never exceeded 245 degrees Celsius. Donnelly blinked. Sir, normal operating temperature is 260. We usually hit 340 before fire starts. Hayes's voice was shaking. That modification, whatever it is, it works. The engine ran cooler than I've ever seen. Tony felt his legs go weak. Donnelly caught him. Tony, you did it. But Tony couldn't speak. 20 years of fixing broken pipes in basements had just saved a bomber worth $500,000, and possibly a crew worth everything. Hayes turned to Tony. Who are you? Antonio Validor, sir. Mechanic. You built that modification. Yes, sir. You have engineering training. No, sir. Just 7th grade school. And plumber. Hayes stared at him. Then he laughed, not mockery, but the wild, disbelieving laughter of a man who'd been given his life back by accident. A plumber. A goddamn plumber just solved what MIT couldn't figure out. Sir, I just make airflow better. Well, your better airflow just saved my life. Hayes stuck out his hand. Thank you. Tony shook it. His hands were still shaking. You're welcome, sir. But word spread fast. By noon, Colonel Jameson had heard about the unauthorized modification. By 1400 hours, Tony and Donnelly were standing in his office flanked by 2 MPs. Jameson sat behind his desk, his face carved from granite. Sergeant Donnelly, you installed an unauthorized modification to military equipment. Explain. Sir, the modification was a cooling bypass designed by mechanic Validor. It successfully reduced engine temperatures by over 60 degrees during today's test flight. I didn't ask if it worked. I asked why you installed it without approval. Donnelly's jaw tightened. Because, sir, pilots are dying. 37 planes lost in 2 months. And while MIT engineers sit in their offices with their equations, a mechanic in my hangar figured out how to fix it. I wasn't going to wait for a committee to approve it while more men burned. That's insubordination, Sergeant. Yes, sir, it is. Jameson turned to Tony. Validor, you're a mechanic. You tighten bolts. You change oil. What made you think you could redesign an aircraft engine? Tony chose his words carefully. Sir, I don't redesign. I just see that hot air has nowhere to go, like water in stuck pipe. I make path for it to go. A path. You made a path. Yes, sir? Jameson leaned back in his chair. Do you understand that if your path had failed, you would have killed Captain Hayes and his entire crew? Do you understand that you risked 9 lives on a hunch? It's not hunch, sir. It's flow. I understand flow. You understand flow. Jameson's voice dripped with contempt. And where did you learn this understanding, MIT, Caltech? My father's basement, sir, in Cleveland. The room went silent. One of the MPs coughed. Jameson's face turned red. Get out, both of you. I need to make some calls. Tony and Donnelly sat outside the office for 2 hours. Neither spoke. What was there to say they'd either saved the B-29 program or destroyed their careers? Possibly both. At 16:15 hours, the door opened. But it wasn't Jameson who came out. It was a general. Tony didn't recognize tall, lean, with eyes that could cut steel. You Validor? Yes, sir. I'm General Curtis LeMay. I flew in from Omaha when I heard about your pipe. He pulled up a chair and sat down facing Tony. No desk between them. No formality. Just 2 men talking. Tell me how it works. Tony explained simply, clearly, using his hands to show the flow path. LeMay listened without interrupting. When Tony finished, LeMay was quiet for a long moment. Then, how much does it cost to build? Maybe $30, sir, in materials. How long to install? 2 hours. Maybe less if you know what you're doing. And you're certain it works. Captain Hayes flew 47 minutes at full power, no overheating, no fire. LeMay stood. He looked at Donnelly. Sergeant, you're not getting court-martialed. You're getting a commendation. Then to Tony. Validor, as of right now, you're assigned to a special engineering team. Your job is to oversee installation of your cooling bypass on every operational B-29 in the United States Army Air Forces. You'll work with Wright Aeronautical to mass-produce the design. You'll train mechanics at every airfield, and you'll do it in 30 days. Tony's mouth went dry. Sir, I'm just a mechanic. No, you're the man who fixed what everyone else said was broken. That makes you more valuable than every engineer in New Jersey. LeMay's voice dropped. Validor, do you know how many pilots I've lost to engine fires? No, sir. 43. 43 men under my command. Good men. Men with families. His eyes were ice and fire. If your pipe saves even one of them, you'll have done more for this war than 1,000 engineers. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. Now get to work. We're running out of time. That night, Tony sat in the enlisted men's barracks, staring at his hands. They were still bleeding from the cuts, still stained black with grease. The same hands that had fixed leaking pipes in Cleveland basements. The same hands that had just changed the course of the air war in the Pacific. Donnelly sat down beside him. "You okay?" "I don't know." "Tony, you're a hero. You know that, right?" "I'm not a hero. I just fixed a flow problem." "You fixed a problem that MIT couldn't solve. Boeing couldn't solve. The best engineers in the country couldn't solve." Tony looked at him. "Mike, I'm scared." "Of what?" "What if I'm wrong? What if one pipe works, but 1,000 pipes fail? What if someone dies because I was too stupid to see something engineers would see?" Donnelly put his hand on Tony's shoulder. "You're not stupid. You're the smartest man I've ever met. You just think different. And right now, different is exactly what we need." But Tony couldn't shake the fear, because in 30 days, thousands of his pipes would be installed on hundreds of bombers. And if he was wrong, if his simple solution had some flaw he couldn't see, then he wouldn't just fail. He'd kill. And that weight was heavier than any wrench he'd ever carried. Across the country, in the Wright Aeronautical offices in Paterson, New Jersey, Dr. Richard Whitman received a phone call that made his blood run cold. "Dick, it's Arnold. I'm sending you a mechanic from Kansas. Name's Validor. He's got a cooling modification that works. Sir, we're close to our own solution. We just need another few weeks. You've had 16 months. This man had 2 hours and some scrap aluminum. You'll work with him. You'll mass produce his design. And you'll do it without complaint. Clear. Sir, with all due respect, this mechanic, does he have any engineering credentials? He has 7th grade education and a wrench. That's 2 more things than you need to solve this problem. Get it done, Dick, or I'll find someone who will." The line went dead. Whitman set down the phone and looked at his team of engineers, 12 brilliant men with advanced degrees and years of experience. And now they were being ordered to take instructions from a plumber. Patterson spoke quietly. "Dr. Whitman, what do we do?" Whitman closed his eyes. He thought about every failed test, every calculation that didn't translate to reality, every phone call from Arnold asking why pilots were still dying. Then he opened his eyes. "We learn from him, because apparently a plumber can see what we can't. And if that doesn't humble us, nothing will. Because genius doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it wears coveralls and carries a wrench. And when that happens, the world has 2 choices: learn from it, or let pride bury the truth under a mountain of degrees that mean nothing to the men who burn." March 18, 1944. Tony Validor stepped off a military transport plane at Newark Airport and into a world he didn't understand. A staff car waited on the tarmac. The driver saluted him. Tony didn't know how to salute back. "Mechanic Validor." "Yes." "I'm to take you to Wright Aeronautical. Dr. Whitman is expecting you." The drive to Paterson took 40 minutes through industrial New Jersey factories, belching smoke warehouses stacked with war materials, workers streaming in and out of shifts. Tony pressed his forehead against the window. He'd never been east of Ohio. Never seen cities this big, this dense, this hungry. The car pulled up to a massive brick building, Wright Aeronautical Corporation. The sign out front read, "Building Tomorrow's Victory Today." Tony clutched his canvas bag containing the original pipe prototype and a notebook with sketches. Everything he owned that mattered. Inside, a receptionist led him through hallways lined with engineering diagrams and photographs of engines. Workers in white coats moved past carrying clipboards, slide rules, blueprints. They looked at Tony Coverall's grease-stained hands, 7th grade education, and their eyes said everything. What is he doing here? Dr. Whitman's office was on the 3rd floor. The receptionist knocked. Dr. Whitman, Mechanic Validor is here. Send him in. Tony walked into a room filled with books, equations on chalkboards, scale models of engines. Whitman sat behind his desk, 50 years old, gray hair, exhausted eyes. Behind him stood 11 other engineers, arranged like a jury. Whitman didn't stand. "You're Validor." "Yes, sir." "General Arnold says you've solved our cooling problem." "I made a pipe that helps airflow better, sir." One of the engineers, Patterson, laughed. "A pipe. That's your solution. A pipe." Tony met his eyes. "Yes." Whitman held up a hand. "Validor, we've been working on the R3350 cooling system for 16 months. We've run thousands of calculations, built dozens of prototypes, tested every variable, and you're telling me the answer is a simple bypass pipe?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Tony set his bag on the desk and pulled out the prototype. "Because hot air has nowhere to go. Your baffles push cold air toward cylinders, that's good. But hot air just circles back, gets hotter, builds pressure. Like water in stuck pipe. My pipe takes hot air away before it builds, creates negative pressure, pulls more cold air through faster." Whitman stared at the crude aluminum assembly. "That's it. That's the whole thing." "Yes, sir." Another engineer spoke up, Thomas Brennan, the oldest one in the room. "Son, do you understand thermodynamics, heat transfer coefficients, boundary layer flow dynamics?" "No, sir." "Then how can you possibly—" "Because I understand stuck things," Tony interrupted. His voice was quiet but firm. "For 20 years, I fixed stuck pipes, stuck drains, stuck water heaters. All same problem, flow stops. Pressure builds, things break. This engine. Same thing, just hotter." The room went silent. Whitman picked up the prototype and examined it. His hands, soft, uncalloused, traced the welds, the brackets, the crude but functional design. "Captain Hayes' test flight showed a 60-degree temperature reduction," Whitman said slowly. "That's significant." "It's impossible," Patterson snapped. "Our calculations show that the airflow through the existing cowling is already optimized. There's no way a simple bypass could—" "Your calculations are wrong." Tony's voice was still quiet. "I'm sorry, sir, but they are." Patterson's face turned red. "You arrogant—" "Enough." Whitman set down the prototype. "Validor General Arnold has ordered us to mass-produce your design and install it on every B-29 in 30 days. Can you work with us?" "Yes, sir." "Even though we're engineers and you're a mechanic?" Tony thought about that. "Then, sir, I don't care about titles. I care about pilots not burning. If you care about that too, we can work together." Whitman's face softened just slightly. "Fair enough. Brennan, clear the conference room. We're starting now." For the next 72 hours, Tony didn't sleep. The conference room became a war room. Blueprints spread across tables, scale models of the R3350, disassembled and analyzed, coffee cups piled in corners. Whitman's team worked around the clock trying to understand how Tony's simple pipe achieved what their complex systems couldn't. Patterson was the most resistant. On the second day, he cornered Tony in the hallway. "You don't belong here. You know that, right?" "I know. These men spent years studying engineering. They have degrees from the best schools in the country. And you what? You fix toilets. Water pipes, mostly in basements." Patterson laughed bitterly. "This is insane. We're taking orders from a plumber." Tony looked at him. "Sir, do you want to be right, or do you want pilots to stop dying? That's not fair?" "It's the only thing that's fair." Tony's voice hardened. "You can hate me. You can think I'm stupid. I don't care. But if you don't help more men burn, and you'll know you could have stopped it." Patterson stared at him, then walked away without another word. But that night, at 0200 hours, Patterson came back to the conference room. Tony was alone refining the prototype design. Patterson set down a stack of wind tunnel test results. "I ran your pipe through computational fluid dynamics," Patterson said quietly. "You were right. The bypass creates a Venturi effect that accelerates airflow through the entire cooling system. It's elegant. Tony looked up. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. I'm still angry that you're right and I was wrong. Patterson sat down. But I'm more angry that 37 planes burned while I was too proud to see the obvious. You're not stupid, sir. You just thought too complicated. And you thought simple. My father used to say complicated makes you look smart. Simple makes things work. Patterson was quiet for a moment. Then, your father sounds wise. He was just a plumber, like me. No. Patterson shook his head. You're not just anything, Validor. And the sooner we all accept that, the sooner we stop burning pilots. By March 25th, Wright Aeronautical had produced the first batch of production pipes, 50 units each one, precisely manufactured to Tony's specifications. But there was a problem. The assembly line workers kept modifying the design, trying to improve it. Tony found out when he inspected the finished units. These are wrong. The foreman, a man named Kowalski, looked offended. Wrong. We added reinforcement brackets, made the welds prettier, used better aluminum alloy. I didn't ask for that. Listen, kid, we've been building aircraft parts for 20 years. We know what we're doing. Tony held up one of the modified pipes. This bracket adds weight, makes installation harder, and this weld too thick. Restricts airflow. That weld is aerospace-grade quality. It's wrong. Tony's voice cut through the factory noise. You make it my way, or you don't make it at all. Kowalski's face turned red. You don't give orders here, plumber. Actually, he does. Dr. Whitman appeared behind them. General Arnold was very clear. Validor's design, no modifications, no improvements, exactly as specified. But Dr. Whitman, no buts. If Validor says it's wrong, it's wrong. Scrap these 50 units and start over. Kowalski looked like he'd been slapped. That's $10,000 in materials. And one bomber is $500,000, plus the crew. Make your choice, Kowalski. The foreman glared at Tony, then nodded. Fine, his way. After Kowalski left, Whitman turned to Tony. You're making enemies. I know. Does it bother you? Tony thought about Captain Hayes, about Donnelly's daughter Claire, about 43 pilots LeMay had lost. No, sir, not if it keeps pilots alive. Whitman almost smiled. Good, because you're going to make a lot more before this is over. March 28, 1944. The first production run was complete, 200 pipes ready for installation. Tony flew to Great Bend Army Airfield in Kansas to oversee the first mass installation. 20 mechanics worked under his supervision, installing the cooling bypass on 10 B-29s simultaneously. Most of the mechanics were older than Tony. Most had more experience, and none of them liked taking orders from a 38-year-old with a 7th grade education. This is bullshit, one mechanic muttered. We're supposed to listen to this guy. His partner, a sergeant named Williams, shook his head. Orders from the top, just do what he says. Tony heard them, but didn't react. He'd learned that lesson in Cleveland. You can't force respect, but you can earn it through work. He grabbed his tools and climbed into the engine compartment of the nearest B-29. Watch, he said. I show you once. For the next 40 minutes, Tony demonstrated the installation, every step, every measurement, every torque specification. His hands moved with absolute confidence. No wasted motion, no hesitation. When he finished, the pipe was installed perfectly. Now you try, he said to Williams. Williams climbed in and started working. Tony watched, correcting small mistakes. Bracket goes here, not there. Tighten to 15 foot-pounds, no more. Vent tube angles down, not up. It took Williams 2 hours to complete what Tony had done in 40 minutes. But when he finished, it was correct. Good, Tony said. Now teach someone else. By the end of the day, all 10 bombers had the modification. The next morning, test flights began. Tony stood on the tarmac at 0600 hours, watching the bombers take off one by one. Each pilot had been briefed. Each crew knew this was experimental. Captain Robert Fitzgerald piloted the first bomber. Tony had met him briefly, a quiet man with steady hands and sad eyes. Fitzgerald had lost his co-pilot 2 months earlier to an engine fire. The man had burned alive while Fitzgerald tried desperately to land. The bomber climbed to 15,000 feet. Full power on all 4 engines. 30 minutes. 45. An hour. Tony's hands were clenched so tight his nails drew blood. Beside him, a ground crew chief named Martinez whispered, "Come on, you bastard. Work." At 0745 hours, the bomber began its descent. Normal approach. Landing gear down. It touched down smooth and rolled to a stop. Fitzgerald climbed out. His face was unreadable. He walked straight to Tony. "Validor." "Yes, sir." "Engine temperatures never exceeded 240 degrees, not even close to the red line." Fitzgerald's voice cracked. "That pipe, your pipe, it works. It actually works." Tony felt his knees go weak. "You're sure?" "I've flown 50 test flights in B-29s. This is the first time I didn't think I was going to die." Fitzgerald grabbed Tony's hand and shook it hard. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to see my son again." Then Fitzgerald walked away quickly, his shoulders shaking. Tony realized the man was crying. Martinez put his hand on Tony's shoulder. "Kid, you just saved that man's life. You know that, right?" Tony couldn't speak. He just nodded. Over the next 3 hours, 9 more bombers landed. 9 more successful tests. 0 fires. 0 failures. The mechanics who'd been skeptical that morning surrounded Tony at lunch. "Validor, I owe you an apology," William said. "I thought you were full of shit. But that pipe, it's a miracle." "Not a miracle, just good flow. Whatever it is, you're a genius." Tony shook his head. "I'm not a genius, I'm just a plumber who paid attention." But not everyone was celebrating. On March 30th, Tony received a telegram from General Arnold's office. "Report to Pentagon immediately. Urgent." The flight to Washington took 6 hours. Tony spent the entire time convinced he'd done something wrong. Maybe the pipes were failing in ways he hadn't predicted. Maybe pilots were dying because of him. He arrived at the Pentagon at 1800 hours. A staff officer led him through corridors to Arnold's office. Inside, Arnold sat behind his desk. General LeMay stood beside him. And in the corner, Dr. Whitman. Arnold looked up. "Validor, sit." Tony sat. His hands were shaking. "We've installed your cooling bypass on 73 B-29s across 5 airfields," Arnold said. "Do you know how many engine fires we've had in the last 4 days?" Tony's throat went dry. "No, sir." "0, not 1. Cylinder head temperatures are down an average of 62 degrees. Mission abort rates have dropped from 31% to 8%. Your modification works, Validor. It works better than we dared hope." Tony felt tears burn his eyes. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. I'm about to ruin your life." Arnold stood. "We need your pipes installed on every operational B-29 by April 30th. That's 347 aircraft. Can you do it?" I don't know, sir." "That's not an option. We need those bombers operational before the Saipan invasion in June. If they're not ready, American soldiers die on beaches. Can you do it?" Tony thought about Fitzgerald crying, about Donnelly's daughter Claire, about 43 dead pilots, and how many more would die if he failed. "Yes, sir. I can do it." "Good. You'll have full authority to commandeer resources, personnel, and materials. Dr. Whitman will coordinate production. You'll coordinate installation." Questions. "Sir, I'm just a mechanic. I don't know how to command." "You're not a mechanic anymore." LeMay interrupted. "You're the man who's going to save the B-29 program. Act like it." Tony looked at Whitman. The engineer nodded slowly. Validor. I'll handle the manufacturing. You focus on getting them installed. We'll work together. Okay. Arnold walked around the desk and stood in front of Tony. Son, do you understand what you've done? You've given us back our air superiority. You've saved hundreds of lives. And you did it with 7th grade education and a wrench. I just fixed a flow problem, sir. No, you fixed a war. Arnold's voice dropped. And now we need you to do it 300 more times. Can you handle that? Tony thought about his father in that Cleveland basement. About water trapped in pipes with nowhere to go. About how simple problems have simple solutions if you're brave enough to see them. Yes, sir, I can handle it. April 15, 1944. Tony had been awake for 36 hours straight. He stood in a hangar at Walker Field, Kansas, watching 12 installation teams work simultaneously. His voice was hoarse from shouting instructions. His hands were bleeding from demonstrating techniques. His back screamed from climbing in and out of engine compartments, but the work was getting done. 147 B-29s now had the cooling bypass. 200 more to go. A young mechanic, barely 20 years old, approached him. Mr. Validor, I think I made a mistake on Bomber 42-24891. Can you check it? Tony followed him to the plane. The kid had installed the bracket upside down. Simple error. Easy fix. Here, Tony said, grabbing a wrench. Watch. He corrected the installation in 5 minutes. The kid watched closely. Thank you, sir. Don't call me sir. I'm not an officer. But you're important. You saved my brother's life. Tony stopped. What? My brother David Marsh. He was a pilot. Died in a training accident 2 months ago. Engine fire. The kid's voice broke. If your pipe had been on his plane, maybe he'd still be alive. Tony felt something crack inside him. Lieutenant David Marsh, February 12th, one of the names in Arnold's reports, one of the 43 dead pilots LeMay had mentioned. I'm sorry, Tony whispered. I'm so sorry I wasn't faster. The kid wiped his eyes. It's not your fault, but every plane you fix now, that's one less family that gets a telegram. That's one less brother who doesn't come home. So thank you. He walked away. Tony stood there, wrench in hand, feeling the weight of every name he couldn't save pressing down on him. But then he looked at the bomber in front of him. Bomber 42-24891, with his pipe installed, ready to fly without burning, ready to bring someone's brother home. Not your fault, he whispered to himself, but your responsibility now. He went back to work. April 30th, 1944. The final B-29 was finished at 23:47 hours, 13 minutes before the deadline. Tony stood in the hangar at Pratt Army Airfield, surrounded by exhausted mechanics, and stared at the completed bomber. 347 aircraft, 347 installations, 30 days of non-stop work. Tony had lost 15 pounds. His hands were covered in scars. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept more than 2 hours. But it was done. Dr. Whitman walked up beside him. Congratulations, Tony. We did it together. No, you did it. We just followed your lead. Whitman held out his hand. I was wrong about you. I'm man enough to admit that. Tony shook his hand. You weren't wrong. You're a good engineer. I'm just a lucky plumber. There's no such thing as luck this consistent. Whitman smiled, the first genuine smile Tony had seen from him. You're brilliant. You just don't know it yet. Because sometimes the enemy isn't superior firepower or brilliant strategy. Sometimes it's just heat trapped in metal with nowhere to go. And the hero isn't the man with the most degrees or the biggest title. He's the man brave enough to see the simple truth everyone else missed and stubborn enough to make them listen. May 1944. Tony Validor had been back in Kansas for 3 days when the orders came through. He was sitting in the enlisted men's barracks, trying to write a letter to his wife in Cleveland, when Sergeant Donnelly burst through the door. Tony, they want you in Saipan. Tony looked up. What? The invasion starts June 15th. They're deploying B-29s to forward air bases. General LeMay specifically requested you be there for the first combat missions. Donnelly's face was pale. Tony, they want you to fly with them. I'm not a pilot. No, but you're the only person who understands those pipes well enough to fix them under combat conditions. If something goes wrong mid-mission, you need to be there. Tony's hands started shaking. Mike, I fix things on the ground, not in the air. I know, but this is what they need. That night, Tony couldn't sleep. He thought about his father, who'd died 3 years earlier, without ever seeing Tony do anything more important than fix a leaking boiler. He thought about his wife Maria, who'd begged him not to enlist, but understood when he did. He thought about all the pilots who were alive because of his pipe, and all the ones who'd died before he'd figured it out. At 0400 hours, he gave up trying to sleep and walked to the airfield. Captain Hayes was there running pre-flight checks on his bomber. When he saw Tony, he climbed down. Heard you're coming with us to Saipan. Apparently. Hayes pulled out a cigarette and lit it. You scared? Terrified. Good. That means you're smart. Hayes exhaled smoke. Tony, I've been flying combat missions since '42. North Africa, Italy. I've seen flak tear planes apart. Seen fighters blow my wingmen out of the sky. And you know what scared me most? What? Engine fires. Because at least with flak or fighters you can fight back. But engine fires, they just kill you. Slow and hot, and there's nothing you can do. Hayes looked at Tony. You took that fear away. You gave me back my plane. So yeah, you're coming with us. Because we need to know you're there if something goes wrong. What if I can't fix it? Then we die together. But at least we'll know someone tried. June 3, 1944. Tony landed on Saipan aboard a C-47 transport. The island was barely secured. Fighting still raged in the northern hills. The airbase was crude, carved out of jungle and coral, with steel matting for runways and tents for hangars. The heat was suffocating. The humidity made it hard to breathe. 18 B-29s sat on the flight line, their silver fuselages gleaming in the tropical sun. Ground crews swarmed over them, loading bombs, fueling tanks, checking systems. Tony walked the line, inspecting each cooling bypass installation. Everything looked good. But good on the ground didn't always mean good at 20,000 feet over enemy territory. LeMay arrived that afternoon. He'd flown in from Guam to personally oversee the first combat mission. He found Tony in the maintenance tent going over flight plans. Validor. Tony stood. General, tomorrow we hit Tokyo. First B-29 raid of the war. 18 bombers. Each one carrying 10,000 pounds of incendiaries. LeMay's voice was flat, emotionless. You'll fly aboard the lead plane with Captain Hayes. Your job is to monitor engine performance and make real-time adjustments if needed. Sir, I've never flown a combat mission. I know, but these pilots need to know the man who built their lifeline is up there with them. Psychology Validor. If you're willing to risk your life on your own design, they'll trust it completely. Tony felt ice in his stomach. And if something goes wrong, then you fix it, or we crash. Those are the options. LeMay's eyes were hard. I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm asking you to do your job at 30,000 feet instead of on the ground. Can you do that? Tony thought about Lieutenant David Marsh, about the kid in Kansas who'd lost his brother, about every name in Arnold's reports. Yes, sir. Good. Briefings at 1800 hours. Don't be late. The briefing tent was packed with 18 crews, 10 men each, 180 lives about to fly into hell. Hayes stood at the front with his navigator and bombardier pointing at a map of Japan. Primary target is the Kawasaki aircraft factory in Tokyo. Secondary is the rail yards. We'll approach from the south at 28,000 feet, drop our loads, and get out. Expected resistance includes Type 99 anti-aircraft guns and Ki-43 fighters. Hayes's voice was steady, but Tony could see tension in his shoulders. Flight time 9 hours round trip. That's 9 hours over open ocean, then enemy territory, then back. One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Morrison, 22 years old, raised his hand. Captain, what if we get engine trouble over the Pacific? Then you ditch and pray the Navy picks you up. Hayes looked directly at Morrison. But every plane on this mission has Validor cooling bypasses. Engine fires shouldn't be a problem. Every head in the tent turned to look at Tony. He felt the weight of their stares, hope mixed with fear, mixed with desperate trust. After the briefing, Morrison approached him. Mr. Validor, I just want to say thank you. My dad was a B-29 test pilot at Great Bend. He died in a fire last February. Tony's chest tightened. What was his name? Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison. He was trying to save his crew when the wing collapsed. Tony closed his eyes. He didn't remember that name specifically, but he remembered the date, February 19th, one of the worst days. 3 planes lost in a single afternoon. I'm sorry, Tony whispered. I'm sorry I wasn't fast enough. Morrison shook his head. You saved the rest of us. That's enough. But it didn't feel like enough. It never would. June 15, 1944, 0430 hours. Tony stood on the tarmac in the dark, watching ground crews make final preparations. The air smelled like aviation fuel and ocean salt. His stomach churned. He'd eaten nothing for breakfast, couldn't keep anything down. Hayes walked up beside him. You ready? No. Me neither. Hayes handed him a parachute. Know how to use this. Never wore one before. Pull this cord, chute opens. Try not to land in the ocean or on a Japanese soldier. That's it. That's it. Welcome to combat aviation. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. Come on, time to see if your pipes work when people are shooting at us. Tony climbed into the bomber through the belly hatch. Inside, the crew was already strapped in co-pilot Fraser, navigator, Chen Bombardier Williams, flight engineer, Kowalski radio operator Davis, and 4 gunners Tony didn't know yet. They all looked young, too young. Kowalski pointed to a jump seat behind the flight engineer station. That's yours, Mr. Validor. Stay strapped in until we're over target. If I tell you to check something, move fast. Understood. At 0500 hours, engines 1 through 4 roared to life. The bomber shook. Tony's hands gripped the seat so hard his knuckles went white. He'd installed hundreds of these pipes, tested dozens. But he'd never actually flown with them. What if something failed at altitude? What if cold temperatures changed the airflow dynamics? What if he'd missed something? Some critical flaw that only revealed itself at 28,000 feet. The bomber accelerated down the runway. Tony felt the wheels leave the ground. Then they were climbing higher, higher, and Saipan dropped away beneath them. 18 bombers formed up in a loose V formation and turned north toward Japan. For the first 3 hours, everything was perfect. Tony monitored the temperature gauges obsessively. Engine 1, 235 degrees. Engine 2, 238. Engine 3, 240. Engine 4, 237. All well within safe limits. The pipes were working exactly as designed. At 0830 hours, they crossed into Japanese airspace. The radio crackled. Bandits at 2 o'clock high. Ki-43 fighters inbound. Tony's heart stopped. Through the cockpit window, he saw them 6 Japanese fighters diving toward the formation. Tracers streaked through the air. The bombers' guns opened up deafening thunder that made Tony's ears ring. Engine 3 taking hits, Kowalski shouted. Temperature spiking. Tony tore off his harness and scrambled to the flight engineer panel. The temperature gauge for Engine 3 was climbing 260, 275, 290. A line of bullet holes had stitched across the cowling, severing one of the cooling pipes. Shut it down, Tony yelled. We need all 4 engines to maintain altitude, Hayes shouted back. If you don't shut it down, it'll catch fire. Hayes cursed and killed the fuel to engine 3. The propeller stopped. The bomber shuddered and began losing altitude. Around them, fighters screamed past, guns blazing. Another bomber in the formation Morrison's plane took a direct hit to the wing root. It rolled over and fell trailing smoke. Tony forced himself to focus. The cooling pipe on engine 3 was damaged, but not destroyed. If he could reroute the airflow, maybe he could keep the temperature down long enough to finish the mission. Kowalski, I need a wrench and aluminum tape. Are you insane? We're in combat. Just give it to me. Kowalski threw him the tools. Tony crawled into the cramped space behind the flight engineer station where access panels led to the engine compartment. The bomber was still maneuvering, dodging fighters, and every movement threw Tony against the metal walls. His head cracked against a bulkhead. Blood ran into his eyes, but he kept working. He found the damaged pipe, wrapped aluminum tape around the bullet holes, and used wire to reinforce the connection. It was crude, temporary, and probably wouldn't hold for long, but it might hold long enough. Try restarting engine 3, Tony shouted. Hayes toggled the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. The temperature gauge climbed but slowly. 245, 250, 255, then stabilized at 260. It's holding, Kowalski said. The fighters broke off. The formation continued north. Tokyo appeared on the horizon, a sprawl of factories and warehouses, and the ugly machinery of war. Bomb bay doors open, Williams called. Target acquired. The bomber shook as 10,000 pounds of incendiaries dropped away. Below, fires bloomed across the Kawasaki factory, orange and red and black smoke rising into the sky. Bombs away. Let's go home. The formation turned south. Tony slumped against the bulkhead, exhausted and bleeding and shaking. He'd done it. The pipe had worked. Even with battle damage, even with bullets tearing through aluminum, the cooling system had held together long enough to complete the mission. But Morrison's plane was gone. 10 men dead because a fighter got through. 10 more names for the casualty lists. The flight back to Saipan took 4.5 hours. When they finally landed, Tony crawled out of the bomber and collapsed on the tarmac. His legs wouldn't hold him. His hands were covered in blood, some from cuts sustained while working on the pipe. Hayes knelt beside him. Tony, you okay? Morrison, did he? No. We saw the chute. He's gone. Tony closed his eyes. Another son who wouldn't come home. Another family getting a telegram. And for what? To burn a factory that would be rebuilt in a month. But you saved this plane, Hayes said quietly. You kept us flying. That's 17 men alive because of you. Doesn't feel like enough. It never does. Hayes pulled him to his feet. But it's what we've got. So we do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, until this war ends or we're all dead. Over the next 6 weeks, Tony flew 12 more combat missions. Each one tested the cooling system in new ways: high altitude, low altitude, battle damage, extreme weather. And each time the pipes held. Engine fire rates dropped from 35% to less than 2% across the entire B-29 fleet. Mission success rates climbed from 69% to 93%. The bomber that everyone had called a death trap became the most effective strategic weapon in the Pacific theater. But the cost was high. Of the 18 bombers that flew that first mission on June 15th, only 11 were still flying by August. 7 had been shot down. 70 men dead. 70 more families destroyed. Tony kept a list of their names in his notebook. He didn't know why. Maybe as penance, maybe as reminder. Maybe because someone needed to remember that these weren't just numbers, they were brothers and sons and fathers who'd trusted his simple pipe to bring them home. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb hit Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Tony was in Guam when he heard the news. He stood on the beach, staring at the ocean, and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just exhaustion. Donnelly found him there an hour later. "Tony, we did it. The war's over." "I know. You should be celebrating. You're a hero." Tony shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Mike. Heroes save everyone. I just saved some people. The ones I couldn't save, they're still dead." Donnelly sat down beside him. "Remember when I told you about my daughter Claire?" "Yeah. I got to meet her last month. Got a week's leave. Flew home." Donnelly's voice cracked. "She's beautiful, Tony. She has her mother's eyes. And I got to hold her because you built a pipe that kept my plane from burning." Tony looked at him. "That's good, Mike. It's more than good. It's everything." Donnelly grabbed Tony's shoulder. "You can't save everyone. Nobody can. But you saved me. You saved Hayes. You saved 17 men on that first mission and hundreds more after that. Don't diminish that because you couldn't save them all." Tony wanted to believe him, but all he could see were the names in his notebook. Morrison, Williams, Chen, 70 names of men who'd flown with cooling pipes that worked perfectly, but still died because war doesn't care about engineering solutions. September 1945. Tony returned to Cleveland. The Army discharged him with full honors and a medal he never wore. He went back to fixing water pipes in basements, back to the anonymous work nobody noticed or cared about. But sometimes late at night, he'd hear a plane flying overhead and think about all the B-29s still flying with his pipes installed. He'd think about pilots who'd never know his name but were alive because of him. He'd think about the simple truth his father had taught him, that understanding flow, whether water or air or human life, was the most important skill a man could have. In 1947, Boeing sent him a letter asking for permission to use his cooling bypass design in their new commercial airliners. He said yes. By 1950, every passenger plane in America used some variation of the Validor cooling system. Millions of people flew safely, never knowing they were trusting their lives to a plumber's simple pipe. Tony never told them. He just kept fixing things, kept making flow work better, kept solving problems everyone else said were impossible. Because that's what he was. Not a hero, not a genius. Just a man who paid attention when others didn't. Just a plumber who understood that sometimes the simplest answer is the right one and had the courage to prove it when the world said he was wrong. And so the sky opened, not because of equations or degrees or brilliant theories, but because a man with dirty hands and a 7th grade education saw what needed to be seen and fixed what needed to be fixed. The war ended. The fires stopped. And somewhere over the Pacific, pilots flew home to families they never thought they'd see again, carried on wings kept cool by $30 worth of aluminum and the stubborn wisdom of a Cleveland plumber who refused to let heat win. But Cleveland felt wrong. Tony walked the same streets he'd walked for 38 years before the war, but they didn't fit anymore. He'd go down into basements to fix pipes and find himself listening for the sound of engines, listening for the temperature rising for the first hint of fire that meant someone was about to die. Maria noticed. She'd wake at 0300 hours to find him sitting at the kitchen table staring at his hands. "Antonio, come back to bed." "I can't sleep." "You haven't slept properly in 4 months." "I keep thinking about Morrison, about the others." Maria sat down across from him. She was 40 years old, still beautiful, still the woman who'd married a plumber with no prospects and no education. "You saved hundreds of men." "I know." "Then why do you only remember the ones you didn't save?" Tony didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, but couldn't say it, that every life saved felt temporary, conditional, borrowed. But every death felt permanent and personal, and his fault for not being faster, smarter, better. In October 1945, a letter arrived. Official Army Air Forces stationery. Tony's hands shook as he opened it. "Mr. Validor, You are hereby invited to attend a ceremony at Wright Field, Ohio, on November 10, 1945, where you will be awarded the Medal for Merit for exceptional service to the United States. Transportation and lodging will be provided. General H. Arnold requests your presence." Maria read over his shoulder. "Antonio, this is incredible. The Medal for Merit, that's the highest civilian honor." "I don't want it." "What?" Tony crumpled the letter. "I don't want a medal for doing what any plumber would do. I want the 70 men I couldn't save to be alive." "You can't bring them back." "Then what's the point of the medal?" Maria took the letter from him and smoothed it out. "The point is that someone needs to stand up and show the world that heroes don't always come from universities. That sometimes the man who saves everyone is the one nobody expected. That intelligence isn't about degrees, it's about seeing what needs to be seen." She put the letter in his hands. "Go, accept it. Not for yourself. For every plumber, every mechanic, every person with dirty hands who's been told they're not smart enough to matter." Tony looked at her, then at the letter, then back at her. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll go." Wright Field, Ohio, November 10, 1945. The ceremony was held in a massive hangar filled with B-29s, row after row of silver bombers, each one carrying the cooling bypass Tony had designed. He stood on a stage in front of 300 people, pilots, engineers, generals, politicians. He wore his only suit, 15 years old, too tight in the shoulders. General Arnold walked to the podium. He looked older than Tony remembered, thinner, more tired. The war had aged everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to honor Antonio Validor, a man who saved the B-29 program and in doing so saved countless American lives." Arnold's voice echoed through the hangar. Mr. Validor had no formal engineering training, no degree, no credentials. What he had was the wisdom to see a problem clearly and the courage to solve it when everyone told him he was wrong. Tony felt his face burning. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to be back in Cleveland fixing pipes where nobody knew his name. Arnold continued. "The Medal for Merit is awarded to civilians who perform exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. Mr. Validor's cooling bypass reduced B-29 engine fire rates from 35% to less than 2%. Mission success rates increased from 69% to 93%. By conservative estimates, his design saved over 2,000 lives and 300 aircraft valued at $150 million. The audience applauded. Tony couldn't breathe. "Mr. Validor, please come forward." Tony walked to the podium on legs that didn't feel like his own. Arnold pinned the medal to his jacket. The audience stood and applauded louder. Through the crowd, Tony saw familiar faces, Donnelly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Hayes saluting. Dr. Whitman nodding with something that looked like respect. Patterson, the young engineer who doubted him, clapping harder than anyone. Arnold shook his hand. Speech. Tony looked at the microphone, at the crowd, at the B-29s behind them. He thought about his father teaching him about flow in a Cleveland basement. About Lieutenant Morrison burning over the Pacific. About Donnelly's daughter Claire, who would grow up with a father because of $30 worth of aluminum. "I'm not a good speaker," Tony said, his voice cracked. "I'm just a plumber. My father was a plumber. He taught me that everything in the world is about flow, water, air, heat, life. When flow stops, things break. When flow moves free, things work." He paused. The hangar was completely silent. "These planes, they were breaking because heat had nowhere to go. I just gave it somewhere to go, that's all. I didn't invent anything new. I just remembered something old that my father taught me." Tony's voice grew stronger. "But I want to say something about the men who died before my pipe was ready. Morrison, Williams, Chen, Marsh. 70 names I keep in a notebook. They died because I wasn't fast enough. Because I didn't see the answer sooner. And I think about them every day." Someone in the crowd sobbed. Tony couldn't tell who. "This medal. It's very nice. I'm honored. But it should really go to my father, who taught me to pay attention, and to Sergeant Donnelly, who believed me when nobody else did, and to Captain Hayes, who trusted me enough to fly with my pipe, even though it might have killed him, and to every mechanic who installed these pipes in 30 days when everyone said it was impossible. Tony looked directly at Arnold. "Sir, I accept this medal, but I accept it for them, not for me." The applause was deafening. Arnold gripped his shoulder. "Well said, son. Well said." After the ceremony, Tony was surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, take his photograph, ask him questions. It was overwhelming. He escaped to the flight line and stood beside a B-29, running his hand along the cool aluminum skin. "Mr. Validor." He turned. A young woman stood there, maybe 25 years old, holding a small boy's hand. The boy was 4 or 5 with dark hair and serious eyes. "Yes. I'm Sarah Morrison. This is my son, James." Her voice trembled. "My husband was Lieutenant Andrew Morrison. He died over Tokyo in June." Tony's chest constricted. "I remember. I'm so sorry." "Don't be." Sarah knelt down and put her hands on her son's shoulders. "James, this is Mr. Validor. He's the man who made Daddy's airplane safer." The boy looked at Tony with those serious eyes. "Did you know my daddy?" Tony's throat closed. "A little bit. He was very brave. Mommy says he's a hero." "He was. The bravest man I knew." Sarah stood up. Tears ran down her face. "Mr. Validor, my husband flew 5 missions with your cooling bypass before he was shot down. 5 times he came home when he shouldn't have survived. 5 more times I got to talk to him, hear his voice, tell him I loved him." Her voice broke. "The last letter he wrote, he mentioned you. He said you gave him hope that maybe he'd actually make it home." Tony felt tears burning his eyes. "I failed him." "No." Sarah gripped his hands. "You gave him 5 more chances. 5 more letters. 5 more times he got to see his son's picture and know what he was fighting for. That's not failure. That's grace." She pulled an envelope from her purse and pressed it into Tony's hands. "This is the last letter Andrew wrote. He wanted me to give it to you if I ever met you. He never thought I would." Tony took the envelope with shaking hands. "Thank you." Sarah touched his cheek, a gesture so tender and forgiving that Tony nearly collapsed. "Thank you for giving me 5 more memories. Thank you for trying. That's all anyone can do." She walked away holding her son's hand. Tony stood there holding the letter, unable to move. Finally, he opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise, military. "Mr. Validor. You don't know me, but I know you. Every pilot does. We call your cooling bypass the plumber's miracle. Before you, we flew, knowing we might burn before we ever saw combat. After you, we flew, knowing someone cared enough to fix what was broken. That matters more than you know. I've flown 5 combat missions with your pipes installed. 5 times I pushed those engines to their limits. 5 times they brought me home. I have a wife and a son I've never met. Because of you, there's a chance I'll meet him. If I don't, if I die over Japan or in the ocean, I want you to know it wasn't because your pipe failed. It was because war is cruel and random and unfair. But you took away one piece of that cruelty. You gave us a fighting chance. That's all we ever asked for. Thank you. Sincerely, Lieutenant Andrew Morrison." Tony folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he walked back to the hangar alone, past the celebrating crowds, past the generals and politicians and photographers. He found a quiet corner and sat down on the concrete floor. He'd saved hundreds of men, but Morrison was still dead, and no amount of medals or ceremonies or gratitude could change that simple, terrible fact. The years passed. Tony went back to Cleveland, back to fixing pipes, but the world wouldn't let him disappear. In 1947, Boeing hired him as a consultant for their new 377 Stratocruiser commercial airliner. In 1950, Lockheed brought him in to solve overheating problems on the Constellation. In 1953, Douglas Aircraft asked him to review the cooling systems for the DC-7. Every time he gave the same answer, make sure the hot air has somewhere to go. Every time it worked. By 1960, every commercial airliner in America used some variation of the Validor cooling principle. Millions of passengers flew safely. Nobody knew his name. Tony preferred it that way. In 1965, a young engineer named Robert Kraft came to Cleveland specifically to meet him. Kraft was 28, fresh out of MIT, working for NASA on the Apollo program. "Mr. Validor, I read your Medal for Merit citation. I studied the original B-29 cooling bypass design. I need your help." Tony was 60 years old now, gray-haired and slower. "With what?" "The lunar module. We're having thermal management issues. The electronics generate too much heat in the cabin. We've tried everything. Radiators, heat sinks, active cooling loops. Nothing works well enough." Tony smiled. "Let me guess. The heat has nowhere to go." Kraft blinked. "How did you—" "It's always the same problem. Show me the drawings." They spent 3 days in Tony's workshop, a converted garage behind his house. Tony studied the lunar module schematics, asked questions, made sketches. On the third day, he handed Kraft a simple design, a passive thermal bypass that would vent excess heat directly to space through radiative panels. "Try this." Kraft looked at the drawing. "Mr. Validor, this is brilliant. Why didn't our engineers think of this?" "Because they were thinking about active systems. Pumps, fans, complexity. Sometimes you don't need complicated. You just need flow." Kraft's design, based entirely on Tony's principle, flew on Apollo 11 in July 1969. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, he did it inside a cabin kept cool by the same logic Tony's father had taught him in a Cleveland basement 43 years earlier. Tony watched the moon landing on his television. Maria sat beside him, holding his hand. "You helped put them there," she said. "I just fixed a flow problem." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." In 1975, Tony received another letter. This one from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. "Dear Mr. Validor, we are preparing an exhibit on the B-29 Superfortress and the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. We would like to include your original cooling bypass prototype along with your story. Would you be willing to donate the prototype and participate in an oral history interview?" Tony stared at the letter. The prototype had been sitting in his workshop for 30 years gathering dust. He'd never thrown it away, but he'd never looked at it either. Too many memories. "What do you think?" he asked Maria. "I think people should know. I think your father's wisdom shouldn't die with you." "It's just a pipe." "It's never been just a pipe, Antonio. You know that." So Tony donated the prototype. And in December 1975, he flew to Washington for the oral history interview. The historian's name was Ellen Matthews, a serious woman in her 30s with kind eyes. "Mr. Validor, tell me about the moment you realized what was wrong with the R-3350 engines." Tony thought back to that night in Hangar 7, March 1944. A lifetime ago. "I was looking at the schematic. Everyone else saw an engineering problem. I saw a stuck pipe. My father taught me that stuck things always break. You have to give them a way to flow." "But you had no formal training. Weren't you afraid of being wrong?" "Terrified. But I was more afraid of pilots burning." "What do you want people to understand about what you did?" Tony was quiet for a long time. Then, "I want them to understand that intelligence isn't about degrees or credentials. It's about paying attention. My father paid attention to pipes. I paid attention to him. That's all. If you pay attention to what's really happening, not what you think should happen, but what actually is, then solutions become obvious." "Do you consider yourself a hero?" "No. Heroes save everyone. I just saved some people." "You saved over 2,000 lives. And I remember the 70 I didn't save. Every single name." Matthews stopped the recording. Mr. Validor, may I ask you something personal? Yes. Do you have any regrets? Tony thought about Morrison, about the letter in his pocket that he still carried 30 years later, about all the names in his notebook. I regret not being faster. If I'd figured it out in January instead of March, maybe those 70 men would have lived. Maybe Morrison would have met his son. Maybe Marsh's brother wouldn't have lost him. Tony's voice cracked. But my father used to say you can't fix yesterday's broken pipes. You can only fix today's. So that's what I did. I fixed today's pipes and hoped it was enough. It was more than enough. Maybe, but it never feels like it. Antonio Validor died on February 3, 1982, at the age of 76. Heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful. Maria found him in the morning, his hand still warm. The funeral was small family. A few old friends, some former colleagues. But then the others started arriving. Pilots Tony had never met. Mechanics he'd trained 40 years earlier. Engineers who'd worked with him on the Stratocruiser the Constellation, the Apollo program. Captain Robert Hayes, now retired 70 years old, stood at the podium. Tony Validor saved my life. He saved the lives of hundreds of men I flew with. And he did it not because he wanted recognition or medals or gratitude. He did it because he saw a problem and couldn't rest until it was fixed. Hayes's voice broke. The world tells us that greatness comes from universities and laboratories and brilliant minds in white coats. Tony taught us that greatness comes from paying attention, from caring, from being too stubborn to accept that people have to die when they don't have to. Hayes pulled out a photograph. This is my crew from June 1944. 10 men. 9 of us survived the war. We're alive because a plumber from Cleveland understood flow better than MIT understood physics. He set the photograph on the casket. Thank you, Tony, for everything. After the funeral, a young man approached Maria. He was in his 40s, well-dressed with kind eyes. Mrs. Validor, I'm James Morrison. I don't know if you remember, my father was Lieutenant Andrew Morrison. Your husband met my mother and me at Wright Field in 1945. Maria's eyes filled with tears. I remember. Tony kept your father's letter until the day he died. I know. My mother told me. James pulled out an envelope. She wanted me to give this to you. She passed away last year, but she wrote it specifically for this moment. Maria opened the envelope with shaking hands. Dear Mrs. Validor, by the time you read this, your husband and I will both be gone. I wanted you to know that Antonio Validor gave me the greatest gift anyone could give a widow, 5 more memories of the man I loved, 5 more letters, 5 more chances to hear Andrew's voice and know he was thinking of us. My son grew up knowing his father was a hero, not because he died in combat, but because men like your husband cared enough to try to bring him home. Antonio couldn't save everyone, but he saved enough. And that's all Grace ever asks of us, that we try. Thank you for sharing him with the world. With love and gratitude, Sarah Morrison. Maria clutched the letter and wept. Today, Tony Validor's original cooling bypass prototype sits in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in a case between a Wright Flyer propeller and a piece of Apollo 11 heat shield. The placard reads, Validor Cooling Bypass, 1944. Designed by Antonio Validor. A mechanic with 7th grade education, this simple aluminum pipe solved the B-29 Superfortress engine overheating crisis and saved over 2,000 American lives. Validor's principle that hot air must have an unobstructed path to escape remains fundamental to aerospace thermal management today. Every year, thousands of people walk past that case. Most don't stop. It's just a pipe after all. Crude, ugly, unremarkable. But sometimes a child will ask, "What's that?" And a parent will read the placard and say, "That's the pipe that won the war." And the child will say, "It doesn't look special." And the parent will say, "The most important things rarely do." Because Tony Validor wasn't special. He was just a plumber who paid attention when others didn't, who saw what needed to be seen, who fixed what needed to be fixed, who understood that genius isn't about credentials or degrees or brilliance. It's about caring enough to try when everyone says you'll fail. The fires stopped, not because of equations, but because a man with dirty hands refused to let heat win. And somewhere in a heaven, neither theology nor science can prove. Perhaps Antonio Validor sits with his father fixing celestial pipes while 70 names forgiven whisper their gratitude into eternity's flow. If you believe stories like Tony's deserve to be remembered, if you believe that greatness comes not from titles, but from trying, then share this story. Write one name in the comments, the name of someone ordinary who did something extraordinary. The plumber who fixed your impossible leak, the teacher who saw you when no one else did, the mechanic who kept your car running when it shouldn't have. Because the world forgets these names. And we can't let that happen. They deserve better. They deserve to be remembered, not as heroes, just as people who paid attention, who cared, who fixed what was broken when everyone else walked away. Write their name. Let them be known.